I'll start now and we can admit people as they join. So thank you all for coming. I'm Matt Oberstadt. I'm the chapter leader of GW Students for DC Statehood. I've been working on this event with one of our members, Josiah Reedy. And today we have two panelists here who were really excited that they were able to join us. Michael Bekesha and Patrick Mara, who are both DC Republicans who want to make their city the 51st state. So if the two of them would like to introduce themselves, feel free.
Sure, I'll go first. My name is Michael Bekesha. I have been in DC since 2009. I ran for DC Council what seems like forever ago, but it was only 2 years ago. I ran for Ward 6, which encompasses the Capitol Hill area, roughly 90,000 residents, 76,000 registered voters, and that's kind of who I am. And related to statehood, I'm a proponent of statehood, but I'm concerned that DC is not ready for it. And I imagine we'll talk more about that over the next hour or so.
Hi, good evening. My name is Patrick Mara. I've been in DC since 1997. So since probably before a number of you were born, which is kind of sad. But it's great that I've been in DC since 1997. And I came to DC to work for Senator, the late Senator John Chafee. Did a number of other things, got involved in DC politics in 2008 when I ran for DC Council. And then I was later elected to the, I was the first Republican elected to the DC State Board of Education in Ward 1, and I served on that board for 4 years. Live in Ward 7 now in the Randall Highlands neighborhood. And I have been the executive director to the DC GOP. I'm currently a part-time consultant to the DC GOP, among other things. And but that will fade out probably within the next month or two. And so I'm excited to be here. I've supported statehood probably since when I was on the Board of Education, so not when I first ran for DC Council, but likely in, if this were a community forum or running for office, I'd say that I've supported it since I came out of the womb. But in all likelihood, it was probably about 2010, 2011 when I supported when I began supporting DC statehood.
Great. Thank you both for introducing yourselves. One other thing I want to mention for anyone listening is that we are planning to record this event in case anyone wants to watch it afterwards. So if you're not comfortable with being recorded, feel free to turn your cameras off. So the first question to get started is, why do you support DC statehood, and why do you think its appeal should cross party lines? I guess it doesn't matter who goes first, but maybe we'll go with Michael and then Patrick.
Sure. DC statehood makes sense, right? DC has more residents in it than at least 2 states. We pay more in federal taxes than, I don't know, 22, 23, 24 other states. We live here, we work here, we should be able to have representation here, and we should be able to have say in our local government and not have Congress interfere whenever it wants. Should it have cross-party lines appeal? Absolutely. But it doesn't, because of the very practical effect of it is currently a city made up of Democrats. And if we got statehood, we would probably have 2 senators that were Democrats, and it would change the composure, the structure of the Senate. So should it, if you take the 2 senators out, would people support statehood? Probably, but the reality is that probably won't happen.
What are your thoughts on it, Patrick?
Sure, thank you. So I would say that, it's statehood in DC has evolved quite a bit. Like I said, back in 2008, I did not support DC statehood. I would say at that point in time, it was definitely more of a fringe issue, but frankly, Mayor Gray and Mayor Bowser, which is an interesting combination, they made it more mainstream. It really brought more appeal to the issue citywide. It used to be more of it seemed to me, especially in engaging with residents, it was more of a niche issue. I support it because it's it's the right thing. I was a huge advocate for DC voting rights and Tom Davis's bill to at least have a member in the House of Representatives. Then that kind of fell by the wayside. So I figure the worst case scenario here is by supporting DC statehood, you're at least, and I do support it, but on a bad day, you're at least supporting moving the ball in the right direction, educating not only people in the District of Columbia, but nationally. So that I think that's one big problem is people don't recognize there's a problem in DC, that district residents don't have representation. Folks outside the District of Columbia still see DC as what they see on television. So it's like the Capitol, the Washington Monument. They don't recognize the neighborhoods, how the economy's changed, and obviously the population has exploded since frankly Mayor Williams really started to put policies in place to start to grow the population, but that's another discussion. And I think it's the right thing. And I think we'll get into some. Michael brought up some issues, and I think we'll get into some more of the issues as well.
All right. So yeah, we can start by talking about some of those issues. Michael, I know you've expressed concerns about things like the district's finances and provisions in the new constitution that's been proposed for the state. So what changes would you like to see made to DC finances or to that constitution or government structure to prepare for statehood?
Yeah, I mean, so the biggest concern I have is right now DC still gets a lot of money from the federal government. A very concrete and real place to look is our judicial system. Our courts, our judges, our prosecutors, our jail is really all paid for with federal funds, which is somewhere between $700 and $1 billion. And so if we became a state, we would no longer get this federal funds. So the question is, where does DC come up with $1 billion? The easy answer is more taxes, but no one's going to like that as a solution. And as Patrick said, DC statehood is becoming more mainstream. A lot more people are talking about it both locally and nationally, but no one's really talking about the effects, right? No one's talking about, say, this $1 billion that DC is going to need to figure out where to get it. Other concerns I have are the Constitution that is written, the proposed Constitution that's written, keeps the 8-ward structure. It keeps it ANCs. It keeps, it kind of creates the council, creates the legislature. It really doesn't think big picture and out of the box about how we should govern ourselves as what would be a growing state. One of the biggest changes and issues I think we should really look at is changing our elections to nonpartisan elections. As everybody knows, Patrick would know the number better than me, but an extremely high percentage of registered voters in the district are registered as Democrats. Very few Republicans. You do have a decent number of, no party registrations, but it means that elections really are just between Democrats. So one thing, if we really wanted a state, if we really wanted good solutions, elected officials that really speak to the entire population, we should look at things like nonpartisan elections, which a state like Nebraska has, and they also have a unicameral legislature. And so my concern is everybody's excited for DC statehood. Once the Democrats, it seems, takes control of the presidency as well as Congress, it's probably going to happen, but nobody's thinking about, well, what happens that's day one is it becoming a state. What happens on day two? And so that's kind of my concerns with statehood and all the excitement around it.
Yeah, so I certainly share those concerns. I don't think, certainly in all the meetings I participated in with stakeholder groups and such, and I did a lot. I have not been as engaged, I'd say, in the last year or two, but I'm acutely aware of what's going on. I talk to Bo at DC Vote probably every quarter or so. Generally, relates to some sort of ask coming from DC Vote. But in these stakeholder meetings, it's more about the process to get to statehood, and it's not about what we do after. And so, for example, if you look at Michael brought up obviously the courts and the prison system, most of our citizens who must serve time in prison do it in some other jurisdiction that could be, fairly far away. I know that we've brought a number of prisoners closer, but that's really a big deal. And in fact, we've put that in the Republican platform that we should have our own prison system because it's the right thing to do to have prisoners close to families, particularly when you're looking at rehabilitation situations. This is awfully critical. And so I don't think the city's ever taken a serious look at that. And look, we have done things more recently. We have an attorney general. Obviously, the power of the attorney general is still a bit limited. As a state, we'd probably, and I'm just throwing this out there, but everyone talks about making, it comes up to, the ANCs become the House and the DC Council becomes the Senate. But we probably want to throw everything out that we have and create a legislative, just a legislative body. You probably wouldn't have ANCs. You might have two. You might have two bodies. You might be unicameral, as Michael brought up. And then with regard to the nonpartisan situation, that is actually a really big deal because if you look at Boston, Chicago. I believe it's the National League of Cities, but it's right on their website. And it could have been updated, but the last I knew, 70 some odd % of urban areas, mostly names run nonpartisan elections. And so, look, that's not going to turn the city Republican. That's not even going to turn the city probably 20% Republican. But what it does is it levels the playing field because a lot of people do just vote for the D, and that sometimes you may be quite happy with that, but I know a lot of times over the years there's a lot of Democrats who have not been happy with just voting for the D. So once you make it nonpartisan, these candidates actually have to talk about the issues, which really does level the playing field because right now I've debated at literally over 100 forums. One of the largest refrains is "I'm a Democrat. I'm a Democrat," over and over again. And look, I've debated with, I've been on the same panel night after night with two Democrats who served time in prison, who had been elected in DC. So this nonpartisan issue is a really big deal, and that probably would make a big difference in moving the ball forward on statehood. But I agree with I think everything. I agree with everything that Michael said as well.
Thank you. So since you've touched on things like the judicial system and local laws, do you think that having more local autonomy over like local issues in DC would benefit the district?
We would have to put all of our stuff in.
Yeah. Well, even if it doesn't benefit the district, we should do it anyhow. Michael and I are Republicans, so we believe that local jurisdictions should have control over legislative and budgetary authority. So that's actually, it's a fundamentally, Republican issue. I mean, I've lobbied lots of, again, more so in the leading up to the previous couple of years, but I explained to a couple different members who introduced gun legislation, and since that meeting, they never introduced it again. So I think the one thing I want to bring up here is in terms of the advocacy, you know, it would make sense, and this, I know this comes up from time to time, but it would make sense to have on the Republican side more professional advocacy, because I know when I used to volunteer, I was on the board of DC Vote for a little while, but when I would volunteer to go up to do the advocacy days, well, I was the only Republican, and then the other Republicans were people from law firms. And I know, look, I know this is something they've been working on, but why don't you hire a former Republican senator to lobby on DC issues? I never understood this. You know, there's people, when you go up to the Hill, and if I know some of the students, some of the have at least interned on the Hill, and you know, there's a lobbyist for everything, but we really have not professionalized. And certainly Bo at DC Vote has brought this to the next level. They are, you know, they've really gotten the word out, but they've gotten the word out kind of along one channel. And so professionalizing lobbying on the Republican side, hiring a hired gun would go a long way. And there's ways to do that. And I just never understood why they didn't do that. It's almost like we want to fail on the Republican side.
Yeah,
and
going
this
back
this isn't just, I'm not just talking about statehood there, but even with the riders on budgetary and legislative authority, you know, I've done at least, you know, I can say this now because he's no longer in Congress, but I literally sat down with Jason Chaffetz and we talked about a whole host of issues, and he never introduced, after that meeting, and Bob Cable, the former chair of the DC GOP, was in the meeting as well. After that meeting, he never did introduce something that was in opposition to marriage equality in the District of Columbia. So it's, some of this is about engagement, and then the words, especially on the left and the far right, the language that one uses is very different. And so I think part of the problem too is the messaging that in particular a DC Democrat may use if they're trying to lobby a Republican. The Republican hears like all these phrases and words, and I'm like, whoa, why are you using those words? So if professionalizing advocacy, whether it's statehood or budgetary legislative authority or something else, would make a lot of sense. And I don't understand why we haven't done that.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with that. And, you know, Patrick said, you know, local autonomy is really at the heart of what the Republican Party should be, right? Congress should not be legislating what happens in urban areas, what happens in states. And so it never really made sense. The other problem you have is Republicans in Congress like to use DC issues as, you know, waving them around to their constituents back home, taking tough social positions that they would never necessarily take at home, but it's easy to do when you're affecting lives of people in DC and not in their home district. However you feel about, for example, however you feel about marijuana, you know, DC was supposed to essentially legalize marijuana. However, DC hasn't been able to enact any regulations related to it, make money off of it, because Congress prevents DC from doing so. So if DC became a state, that would change, and DC could regulate marijuana, tax marijuana, make money off of marijuana, which, you know, may not be a bad thing. It may also prevent all the streets smelling like marijuana if you could regulate it a little bit more.
And most of these, oh, sorry, Michael.
Oh, no, go for it.
I was gonna say most of the riders though, because when you talk about Republicans in Congress, that's almost become part of a typical community speech. Like, if it wasn't for those Republicans in Congress, reelect me, by the way. You know, I mean, it's this ongoing refrain that is used over and over again. I used to watch, Mayor Barry, Mr. Barry do that. I guess he was mayor. And I used to watch Congressman Norton. And then Mayor Gray really started to, there's an uptick. But most of the time, the so-called Republicans in Congress are really very junior kind of fringe House members. And for them, right, if you're pro-life, I mean, think about all the money you're able to, and this is a practical class that's in Washington, D.C., so you understand this. Think about all the money you're able to raise if you just introduce some writer that does something to defund abortions in the District of Columbia, right? Now you're like set for the next 6 years because you just used a writer that is going to get blogged about a lot. So it's usually these fringe people. When Darrell Issa was the chairman of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, and Congressman Norton will even say this, he was excellent for the District of Columbia. But he said to me, look, I want to just leave DC alone. And Trey Gowdy said the same thing. The problem is it's the, kind of the fringe members of Congress, more junior, who nobody is meeting with. And this also is why, if we had a more professionalized lobbying effort on the Republican side, you imagine if you had just a lobbying shop with a Republican lobby shop, or even a bipartisan one, but you have a former Republican member of the House there. Well, they can call that member of Congress up, or they can approach him on the floor and say, hey, I need you to do something for me. So again, this is why there needs to be more of a professionalized Republican effort.
Thank you. So control of the Senate it will be decided by 2 runoff elections in Georgia, and Republicans have a pretty good chance of winning those. So Republican votes would be needed to pass any DC statehood bill in Congress. What do you think we can do to convince our Republican friends, neighbors, and members of Congress to support making Washington, D.C. a state?
Nothing. If the Republicans win the 2 seats in Georgia, and so they have a 2-seat majority, then adding 2 Republican seats for the District of Columbia gives the tie to the vice president. So that's not going to happen. And that's just the practical political reality of the situation. Maybe Pat has a brilliant way to get around that and come up with talking points, but as a practical reality, I don't see that happening.
No, it will definitely. There won't be as much of a focus, obviously, on the issue. You've seen. I just saw a tweet somewhere from Tom Cotton. So it's becoming on the left, and so this kind of became a problem when DC vote, although it worked because it really raised the profile of the issue. To a certain extent, it worked, but now it's a partisan issue because it's being scorecarded by groups on the left. It's becoming more mainstream on the left, whereas on the right you have people like Tom Cotton, who maybe could be running for president in a couple of years, and Ted Cruz and obviously Mitch McConnell, speaking out against it. So that also kind of ties the ability, like, say, even if you look at like a Lisa Murkowski, who might be more flexible, or a Susan Collins, who now could be significantly more flexible. Do they want to kill all their chits on this? That's going to give 2 Democrats the Senate. So it's definitely unlikely that anything happens.
Okay. One thing I've noticed in my experience going to the Hill to talk about DC issues, whether it's been Democratic or Republican offices, is that they would only feel like they need to prioritize it if they're hearing about it from their constituents back home. So if you don't think there's any way to convince these Republican members of Congress directly, maybe we can talk about more on the grassroots level, what we can do to persuade Republicans elsewhere in the country, or people outside of DC more generally in their home states and districts, to get them to, let their legislators know they care about this. If you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, Pat talked a little bit about the success of DC vote, but also about the language they use isn't language that's going to convince any Republican. That he or she should support the cause, right? Talking about the 2 additional senators probably doesn't work. Talking about it in terms of voting rights probably doesn't work. But if you talk to Republicans about the importance of local government, self-control, keeping Congress out of basic decisions of an urban area, that's more a Republican language. So I think when we're talking about lobbying, when we're talking about grassroots efforts of writing letters to Republican congressmen, when we're talking about how to talk to families and friends that are Republicans around the country, talk about how they don't want Congress deciding issues related to their day-to-day life. Talk about how they don't want Congress overseeing and approving every law that their city council passes. And, that's the language that's going to move the needle a little bit. Talking about, the big trendy ways Democrats are talking about it these days isn't going to work.
And taxes. Taxation without representation.
All right. So moving to some of the concerns that people have expressed about DC statehood, one of the ones that I often hear and that the 2 of you have already talked about is how people don't believe a state of DC would be politically competitive. So in your experience as Republican candidates in DC, do you think that outlook is correct? And if you want to talk about like what Republican campaigns have looked like in DC in the past.
I'm going to let Pat answer that.
Yeah, so, yeah, no, it would not be competitive today or tomorrow or next year. The city is, and Mayor Barry would say this to me all the time, but the city is changing. And really the kind of the interesting thing is that there's more people on the far left moving into the city than there are in the middle or on the right. But there are pockets of, say, like Navy Yard. I think Navy Yard is like 30% Republican now, which is, might as well be the Idaho of, or the Utah of DC. And, it's a matter of, will these people stay there? The other elephant in the room would be the national party, and the national leader of the party is controversial among Republicans in DC. So, I don't know the breakdown necessarily, but as you may know, there are a number of Republicans who do not like the president. There are a number who like him, and then there's some who are completely agnostic. So it's a very unusual thing where we probably do have the highest number of Republicans who do not like President Trump. As it turns out, he's probably staying involved after the election. So some of what we're able to do in DC and how we're able to we'll be able to grow the party, but how we're able to grow the party really depends on this. What's going on nationally does impact us, because when you're going door to door and when you're talking to voters, the first things that, when you say if you were to say to a voter, kind of what's on your mind. And so and a lot of you know this, like a lot of the top level issues that were on the front of the newspaper or they're on the news, those are like the first things out of their mouth. But then you really have to like dig down to see, what else how else they feel. But certainly President Trump has been one of those issues on the Democratic side, and with cities like 70, I think it's like 75% registered Democrat, the registrations have changed a bit, which is the highest if we were a state, that's the highest in the nation. And then if you look at the presidential contests, I think we're us and somebody else, or it might just be us. I think we're the only, since we've been able to vote for the presidency, we're the only ones who've gone Democrat every single time. So there's data points there, but like I said, the city is changing. So there would be, down the road, I could see a situation where you would be able to elect a Republican. The person would be a moderate. But again, this is looking from where I'm sitting now, this is a little bit further down the road. You'd be able to like a Murkowski or a Collins, and there's a lot of other people I could name, but I'd have to go back a few years, and none of you would know who those Republican senators are.
So
Yeah, I would just add, the other thing I would add to that is because there hasn't been a Republican on the council in quite some time now, over 10 years, people also don't know what it means to be a Republican in DC. And when I ran 2 years ago and I started thinking about running and started talking to people, it was always, well, what do you care about? What are your issues? What do you think about the issues? And then when you start talking to people about the issues, a lot of them would be like, oh yeah, that's what I think, or that makes sense, or tell me more about it. But because there isn't really an infrastructure in place for Republican ideas in urban areas, especially in DC, any candidate starts kind of at a disadvantage. You have several think tanks in DC focused on issues, but very few of them come from a center-right analysis or perspective.
I think that raises a very interesting question about how do you think that conservative policies could benefit a city like DC, and what can the DC GOP do to appeal to an urban constituency, especially given that the national party might not be exactly what, you might have to differentiate yourself from that.
Yeah, when you're running in a local election, people care about kitchen table issues. They care about the schools, they care about safety, they care about taxes and finances. And so Republicans in DC need to talk about those issues, talk about housing. Crime is going up every year in DC. We're not, quite at the levels we have been historically, but, murder rate is going up almost on a yearly basis. And what we're doing isn't working. And you have all Democrats on the council, Democrat Attorney General, a Democratic mayor. And so if something's not working, it should be fixed. And so it's really talking about issues like crime, like schools, how much and who should be paying what in taxes and where should that money go? Are we wasting money? These are all issues Republicans historically should be talking about and should be strong on. And so really it is not that what we believe in, people in DC disagree with, it's that a lot of people in DC can't get past the R next to your name.
Yeah, and in terms of spending, our per capita spending, and I'm dating, this is a little dated as I haven't updated this factoid, but as of a few years ago, our per capita spending was second only to Alaska. And consider that Alaska, if you're a resident of Alaska, they have the permanent dividend fund. It's actually a fairly socialist state because everyone gets about, $800 to $2,000 per person per child a year in Alaska. So we're second only to Alaska in per capita spending. And then look, we like to spend. Everyone always points to teachers and police and fire, and sure, but we have a massive bloated bureaucracy in our. Sorry, there's some kind of motorcycle going by of bureaucrats. When you engage with, when you have to deal with, say, DCRA, which a lot of people don't, and most people who do are able to hire an expediter. But when you deal with an agency like DCRA or a lot of these agencies, they're very well staffed. OSSI is overwhelmingly, it's just packed with staff. There are staff everywhere. And it was Darrell Issa, and again, this factoid might be a little bit dated, but he had told me that they had researched spending from jurisdiction to jurisdiction as compared to the federal government. And it actually, DC government paid better salaries and benefits than the federal government. And again, this is at this point, this is pretty much hearsay, but we have a very bloated government, an overwhelming number of employees, and set aside police, fire, and teachers live outside the district. And we are probably the most, it never gets discussed just because it's accepted. We're probably the most pro-union, we're among the most pro-union jurisdictions of the nation. So we do all these things that benefit people who live outside the District of Columbia. And then when you look to our disadvantaged populations, we've had the same programs for years and years and years, and we have similar outcomes for years and years and years. And so certainly a Republican, even an occasional moderate or two, would help to steer the discussion. Just to signal one program out, the mayor's summer jobs program, which you can't do away with, which you can't say anything bad about. But look, that doesn't work. I mean, you talk to any number of employers. You hear horror stories about how the kids didn't show up. Last year, they paid a lot of kids not to work. But that's an example, and we've really taken contracting to another level. Folks say that they're doing oversight on the DC Council, but really not much has changed. So having a Republican voice, more Republican voices, moderate voices would at least help to have a reasonable discussion about some of these issues, because we just keep doing the same things over and over again. And part of that's because our budget, we have so much money. Now, this will change a little bit next year when we have last I knew, a $700 million shortfall. But look, a Republican will look at spending more, would look at jobs, opportunities. If we were to tinker with taxes, or we were to incentivize employers to relocate in the district, what does that do? If you were to incentivize employing district residents, if you were to have training programs that were effective, DC is notorious. I know this when I was on the Board of Education, but it's notorious for having training programs that don't work. These folks go through a training program, they get a certificate at the end, but there's really no outcomes measurement of these programs. So that's it for now.
All right. So another common concern I hear from people about DC statehood is that the current statehood bill would take the residential and business parts of the city and make those a state, while leaving the federal government in control of basically the National Mall and some of the government buildings surrounding it. And some people believe that if you do that, it would give the new state too much control over the federal district that remains. So how do you feel about that concern?
So what I could see a situation where they start to move agencies to other jurisdictions. I think that could be a real possibility, where you start to relocate some of these, the more the meat of some of these agencies to other states. I think that could very easily happen. But otherwise, I don't know that's any reason not to kind of move the ball forward on statehood representation and voting rights for district residents.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I've never really understood that argument. What more influence a state of DC would have over the federal government more than it already has now. Also talking about agencies, there are agencies located in other states. I think a good chunk of archives and NASA is in Maryland. Virginia has some of the intelligence agencies, and you don't hear the federal government complaining every day that Virginia or Maryland are preventing the federal government from doing anything. And so I think it's an excuse that people like to use. It was something that the founders were concerned about, and so people like talking about it, but I just don't think it's a real concern anymore.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything, Mike, but I think it is more of a talking point that you would use to start to move some of these agencies out to other jurisdictions well beyond Virginia and Maryland, right? Because, for instance, the two richest counties in America are right there in Virginia. Gee, I wonder why. What's a big part of that? And certainly there's information technology, but there's some pretty important government agencies there that have lots and lots and lots of money. And I have very recently, I was sat with a Republican member of Congress at a dinner, and he asked me what I thought about moving agencies outside, and shouldn't, he said something along the lines of, don't you think, other, jurisdictions. And if you're a House member, if you're a random member of Congress, and you can move, or for that matter, if you're even the senator, if you can move an agency to your state, I mean, look at, West Virginia has some things, Robert C. Byrd, Virginia, Maryland, but I think those movements will probably happen over time. I think we'll see more of that. But the point about DC having too much power, I think that's more used as a talking point to kind of help move things out. So.
All right, I'll ask one more question myself before we open it up to audience participation. So some people have said that they would rather have DC become a new county of Maryland than its own state. So why do you support statehood when some people are pushing for that?
Well, I don't think Maryland wants DC, wants us. So, that's one thing. If I wanted to live in Maryland, I would have moved to Maryland. And I don't think it necessarily addresses all the issues. And you just have different types of issues. I think so. I'm just opposed to that on principle. I moved to DC. I want to live in DC. I don't want to live in Maryland. Maybe Pat has a better answer.
Well, I don't know if I have a better answer, but look, if somebody wants to talk about, promote retrocession, they're getting the message out there that something is different about the District of Columbia. So I certainly welcome anyone who wants to advance any discussion on the fact that DC is different. The first organization that would oppose retrocession in Maryland would be the Maryland Republican Party. I don't think, so that's, the Maryland Republican Party would oppose it. But then after that, unless you have buy-in from Democrats in the District of Columbia, it's not that's just not going to happen. And I don't think that, certainly if you're, because I know Jamie Raskin had supported it for a little while. We were on a panel actually, and we were on a CBC panel, and he brought it up. That's gone away now. But it's not. I really don't think it's I don't think it's likely, just because all the the kind of the moving parts. But look, hey, I'll support anything that advances the message on the fact that DC is different than anywhere else, and we have this problem that we're all second or third class citizens.
All right. So for anyone who wants to submit or to ask questions, you have a couple of options. You can send them to me, you can send them to Josiah, or you can unmute and ask it yourself. I do have one question here from Mark, who asks, should the DC statehood issue be tied to Puerto Rican statehood as a way to gain broader support, or do you think it would be a detriment to the movement?
So in 2012, and it's funny because I guess I can say this everywhere now, but I was a delegate for Mitt Romney at the Republican National Convention in 2012, and I sat with Louis Fortuna. I can't remember his name, but he was the governor of Puerto Rico. We were at the CNN Grill, and we both had a beer, and I talked to him about Puerto Rican statehood. And he said it was extremely, really the interesting thing is the movement in DC is much more recent. I mean, I'm not saying that nobody supported statehood, but I'd say that kind of the critical mass in DC that has grown it seems to be much more. It's really grown at a rapid pace, much more recently. Whereas Puerto Rico, it's not. Here, if you had a vote on statehood, it would pass, right? And it would probably pass as much as anything you put on the ballot that's a referendum in DC. It just passes like 70%, 80%. It would pass. Puerto Rico, it wouldn't. It might not pass. And the other issue there is that, right now, they don't pay federal taxes. So if you're a Puerto Rican, or you're an interest in, say I don't want to say special interest, but if you're a wealthier person, you're some kind of entity that benefits from the tax status of Puerto Rico, well, you don't have any reason to support statehood. The other big thing with Puerto Rico is we're actually, DC is a relatively wealthy jurisdiction. Puerto Rico, I believe Mississippi is currently the poorest state in the union. Well, Puerto Rico is like, way down the line, way down in terms of like poverty, and it sounds terrible, but kind of from the perspective of what the United States would need to do. And so I don't know that among the citizens, I don't know that there's a majority. And I think the interesting thing is I think fewer people in Puerto Rico support Puerto Rican statehood than do in DC, even though they've been talking about Puerto Rican statehood at kind of the mainstream for a much more longer period of time. So the answer is I think it's one of those. I think it's a nice talking point to talk about another, like, oh yeah, us in Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico, because obviously the governor I was talking to is a Republican. He's not governor anymore. He's the national committee man for Puerto Rico. But you're going to elect a Republican or two out of Puerto Rico, and so that's eventually what DC would. That's eventually kind of the direction DC would go in time. But it's yeah, I think it's very different from DC. I think it's very different from DC.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Pat. That's a good talking point. I think it's important to highlight, it's a good way to talk about DC. It's a good way to talk about the differences between DC and Puerto Rico. I was always under the impression that majority of Puerto Ricans didn't really want statehood. I have seen that it was on the ballot this past, I guess, what are we, 2 weeks away from the election at this point? And they seem to have voted overwhelmingly in favor of statehood. So I think it's something that the conversation should continue. I don't think it helps. I don't think it really hurts DC about what's going to happen in the end. But I think it just adds to a talking point that it shows that DC is different and we should be talking about statehood.
I guess I missed that election.
All right. Are there any other questions or maybe comments that people want to make? One other thing I might ask is, so every once in a while, I'll hear someone say, like, maybe we don't need to give DC representation if we just take away the taxes. So how do you feel about that idea? No taxation or representation.
So this will also be kind of along the lines of retrocession. I completely support it, but it's unlikely for a number of reasons. But I think it's a good talking point. For example, this is one of those things. Right now, if you look at the new Republican members of Congress, probably if you look at any Republican member of Congress over the last 2, 4, 6 years who's new, they really don't have positions on this, on anything. And so having kind of different policies to kind of advance the rights of district residents, it at least gets them thinking about it and it gets them engaged. And so again, this is another one of these policies that at minimum you're promoting to Americans, you're promoting to members of Congress that DC has this special situation where they don't have the same rights as other Americans. I have spoken to Louis Gohmert, who has sponsored the bill on the no DC, no taxation without representation bill. And he says, and this has also been written up, but that, he was sitting in traffic, he was mad at something, which I can picture. And literally he looked at a license plate, he saw the license plate, and he said, this is, he was thinking to himself, this is completely ridiculous. And then all of a sudden, an epiphany, wait a second, they're right. They don't have they don't have representation and they're taxed. And so that's why he introduced the bill. So I think on a bad day, it's getting somebody to take a position. It's getting somebody to engage in the fact that DC doesn't have the same rights as other Americans. And it's getting people thinking, what can we do in the district? If statehood, because there still could be an opportunity. If statehood doesn't work, there could be a future voting rights opportunity. And actually looping this bet, which I don't currently see, but looping it back to Puerto Rico, I think this is why, in DC, we like to have these kind of pairs like, oh, well, they'll also get statehood. And at the time of voting rights, we were kind of aligned with Utah, because Utah, at that point in time in the census, was seen as the highest population growth state. And so in the voting rights bill, if you were to give DC another House member, well, Utah would also get another House member. So that all kind of worked out. But I think that the no tax issue, I don't like. I'm fine with anyone talking about it, anyone promoting it, just because, again, it's getting people thinking about the fact that DC doesn't have representation in Congress.
I would just make the point it's never going to happen because DC pays more federal taxes than over 20 other states. Yeah. So it really is a non-issue of something that could happen. Well,
yeah, and the other issue would be is I have a rental property I used to live in Columbia Heights. It's a rental property. And if DC didn't have taxes, like overnight, it's now like I can sell my place in Columbia Heights and go retire as a wealthy man because someone will buy that, because real estate will just go through the roof in the District of Columbia, because it'll become a place that you can move to and not pay federal taxes. All right.
I see another question here that says, without naming names, have you come across any elected Republicans from outside DC who believe that DC statehood is the right thing to do, or is it too toxic for elected officials in the party?
It's probably, at this point, it's probably too toxic, because you've had President Trump, tweet about it, anti-statehood. You've had, now, the future, kind of elected leader of the party, Mitch McConnell, speak about it at length, quite frequently more recently. And then you have just any number of Republican senators now, the more very conservative senators discuss it. So it's for the average elected official outside the district, it's something that they don't even think about, just because the only thing they hear about it is from Republicans is this is a bad thing.
I don't have anything to add.
All right. Then I will say, if anyone wants to get more involved in Students for DC Statehood or the DC Statehood issue, you can email me. And I just dropped my email in the chat. I don't see any other questions. So if anyone has either of you have any final thoughts that you want to say before we go, feel free. All right. Then
just keep up your advocacy no matter what.
All right. Thank you all for coming, and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.